Hello everyone, Uzi here. Now I've got a podcast here that I did over a year ago, but it wasn't meant to be on YouTube. But as fate would have it, I got it on Zoom. So it's not great quality. As I said, it wasn't meant to be on YouTube at all, but it's still a good watch. But it's a really important take on something that I'm pretty passionate about, and it's from the great Dr. Peter Brukner, who is, as I call him, the godfather of sports medicine in Australia. I'm sure a lot of people who do medicine already know about him. So I hope you really enjoy this. Dr. Peter Brukner, thanks for being on Kicking It with Khawaja, mate.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Rails. Thanks for the invitation.
Doc, I want you to talk about your journey with me because I think my viewers need to understand who I'm talking to. You're obviously a doctor and you're not a sportsman. You're not out there in the public eye and people, on social media, whatnot, and all over you. But I have not walked past a person who's studying sports medicine or physiotherapy with a Brukner and Khan book under their hand. I see it everywhere I go. And the thing is up to their fifth edition now?
Yep. Yeah,
fifth edition.
Yeah.
No one gets a fifth edition book without being someone. So I want you to talk to the journey from being Peter Brukner, just average daily old fella, getting his medical degree, all the way up to Mr. Fifth edition, working for Liverpool, working for Cricket Australia. So just give the viewers listeners an understanding of where you come from.
Right. Well, oh God, where do you start? Okay, so grew up in Melbourne, went to school in Melbourne, always loved sport. Like sport was my big thing. Spent my whole childhood playing sport, watching sport, reading about sport and so on. Mainly, all the usual stuff, cricket, footy, probably mainly cricket, but cricket, footy, tennis, swimming, you name it. I loved it. I probably came to the realisation that, in my teenage years, that I probably wasn't going to make it as an AFL player for South Melbourne as it was then, or a walk out to bat at Lords or anything like that. So I figured I had to come up with a plan B. So what I really wanted to do when I left school was to become a sports commentator. But my mother, as some mothers do, convinced me to do medicine. So I thought, oh, okay, I'll do that. And so I did medicine. Got my degree, went over to England, worked for 3 years, watched a whole lot of sport. London's a great place to watch sport, so I spent 3 years watching sport and doing a bit of work in between. And then came back to Australia. Started off. So sports medicine didn't really exist then. We're talking 1980, early 1980s. There was just a few people starting to get a bit interested in it. So I started off in general practice and sort of developed a bit of a following from sports people and so on. And then a few years later, had the opportunity to go full-time into sports medicine. And so I opened up a clinic in Melbourne called Libby Park Sports Medicine Clinic, which is probably the biggest, longest serving and longest standing and biggest clinic, sports medicine clinic in the country. Got very involved in trying to create a specialty of sports medicine. So back in those days, anyone could basically put up their hand and say, I'm a sports medicine specialist and so on. But
Right.
So there was no process, there was no recognition of sports medicine as a specialty in medicine. So we developed that over about a period of 15 years and so on. Lots of hard work, setting up a training program for young doctors who want to come through. And, I think one of the first ones that came through was Johnny Orchard, who is familiar to many people in the sporting world. And
Staples and State of Origin.
Yeah, indeed, yes. So Johnny was one of our first, what we call a trainee in sports medicine and so on. So that's been good. We've set up that specialty.
So was yours the first practicing medical for sports? Were you saying you're the first in Australia?
Yeah, there was 3 or 4. There was a couple in Sydney, another 1 or 2 in Melbourne, one in Adelaide, and they were really what we call multidisciplinary sports medicine clinics. So you had doctors, physios, massage therapists, dietitians, psychologists, all under the one roof, which is pretty unusual in medicine. So that sort of concept of the sports medicine centre really started in the 1980s with a few different clinics. And they were great places to work at, really dynamic people there, and it was good fun. And then along that, in sports medicine, you tend to work with teams. So I started off, I had a big involvement with sport at university. So I sort of played footy, AFL footy at Melbourne University and got very involved with the club there, and I'm still involved with there 50 years later. And I was president of the club for many years and so on. So through that, I actually got invited to become the doctor for the Australian team for the World University Games in Canada. And that was my first sort of big break, really, if you like. You know, you get an overseas trip and you get to meet people, and one thing led to another. I did a few more World University Games, and then got invited to be the Australian swimming team doctor, and then finished up with athletics. Did 10 years as the Australian athletics team doctor in the 90s. Went to lots of world championships and Commonwealth Games. Went to the Atlanta Olympics as the athletics team doctor, and then the Sydney Olympics as the head of the athletics team. I was sort of the team manager of the athletics team for Sydney. That was a fantastic experience. And then took a bit of a break from travelling and so on. So while the kids were growing up in teenage years and so on, and then got approached to do the Socceroos, the Australian soccer team, back in when was that? 2007. So did a full World Cup campaign with them, 4 years up to South Africa World Cup. The day we got knocked out of the World Cup in South Africa, I was on a plane to Liverpool, England, where I'd been appointed head of sports medicine and sports science at Liverpool. Spent 3 years there, and then cricket came along. And cricket had been my first love as a sport, but I'd never sort of worked in cricket just because that's the way your career works. Sometimes different opportunities arise and other people were doing cricket. But out of the blue, I got an invitation to do a tour, a one-day tour in the UAE with cricket, and I thought, no, that'd be fun. So, and then that led to a permanent role. Cricket had never had a full-time sort of doctor. They never had a permanent doctor. Everyone else in the team was permanent. The physio, the masseur, the manager, the coaches.
Yeah, we had new ones coming in all the time.
The doctors. Yeah. And I sort of thought, well, that's crazy. I mean, what does it say about the importance of the doctor? Anyone will do, sort of thing. And there was no continuity.
I tell you,
and so,
you don't actually know how much you need a doctor until you actually need a doctor. Like until something actually happens.
That's right.
Holy crap!
Yeah, you sit around watching a lot of cricket, but every now and then you're useful. So, yeah. So I then finished up doing 5 years with the cricket team. An amazing time. And then finished up there 3 years ago, and then as we'll no doubt talk about, I got very interested in the last few years. I've been very interested in nutrition and so on. So I've become, I'm doing that most of my time now. During that whole period, I did a lot of writing. As you said, I wrote a textbook way back in the early 90s. I got approached to write a textbook, and I sort of thought, oh no, I'm too young to write a textbook of sports medicine. And then my colleagues all reminded me that I'd basically bagged the crap out of every other sports medicine textbook that had ever been written. So I thought, oh well, I'll see if I can do better myself. And I just spent a year writing that with a colleague, Karim Khan, a friend of mine, and it turned out to go really well and become very successful. And as you said, it's now in its 5th edition, and we must have sold 200,000 copies, and it's become it's known as the Bible of sports medicine, and it's been great. We started off pretty much writing it ourselves, but now we've got a whole bunch of people around the world who are contributing, and it's become very much a team thing, and that's led to lots of opportunities and lots of travel and lots of invitations to speak at overseas conferences and university positions. I'm a professor at La Trobe University here in Melbourne, so I'm involved in a bit of research and so on. So yeah, it's been very lucky. The timing's, it's all about timing, and I was very lucky to get into sports medicine just when it was sort of taking off, if you like, and it's been a great journey.
Being the godfather of sports medicine, as I'm going to call you now, did you see much difference between when you see a team like Liverpool and when you see the Australian cricket team in terms of professionalism, in terms of just the all-out structure, the money they have over there? Was it much different?
Well, the money certainly was, that's for sure. I mean, it's money for me, but that wasn't too bad. But no, the money,
you're doing it right, Doc. Come on.
Players are being paid. No, it was interesting. I mean, you sort of you go to somewhere like Liverpool in the Premier League, and this is back in 2010. So I think things have changed, but and you assume that, wow, there's so much money and prestige, and this must be the most, well-run, incredibly organised, with everything and really, to be honest, it wasn't. I mean, it was a bit of a shambles, the club, when we got there. They were in the middle of trying to sell the club, and there were, new owners, and it really was a mess. And it wasn't that well resourced, and it wasn't that what they were doing there wasn't that fantastic compared to an AFL or an NRL club, where I think the sports medicine and the sports science was probably well ahead of the Premier League in those days, which is, came as a shock to us, and to I guess that's why they appointed someone from Australia rather than appointing someone from the UK. They perceived, I think rightly, that Australia was leading the way in those days. So they thought, well, I'll get an Australian in, and I got a bunch of other Australians to join me. Darren Burgess, the high performance manager, and Phil Coles, the physio, came along as well. And I think we sort of shook things up a little bit at Liverpool. So it wasn't that amazing as far as the standard of their sports medicine, sports science. What was amazing was firstly the passion. And the whole city of Liverpool is just obsessed with football. Yeah. And I'll be walking down the street and people will be stopping me, and how's Stevie's knee, and how's this, and how's that, and it's sort of become it's amazing. I mean, you just couldn't escape it. And it was fantastic. I mean, the city of Liverpool is a great city. I mean, when I first got appointed, I thought, Liverpool. I mean, I lived in England previously when Liverpool was sort of having a rough time, and initially I thought, great club, shit city. And then when I got there, I thought, shit club, great city. It was a terrific city to live in. And, any city that has two obsessions of football and the Beagles can't be a bad city, really. So, So that was good. The money is crazy, really. The amount the players were paid. And I think generally, I just had the feeling it wasn't the same
amount of money go into sports meds as it goes into players.
No, it traditionally had not. Things have changed a bit, I must admit, in the last 10 years. But traditionally, they'd spent all this money on players and very little on keeping them on the park, which seemed to me crazy. I mean, you'd be paying players literally, £100,000 a week. And then, but you wouldn't have a physio, or a couple of physios to look after them, and so on. So that has changed, I think, with some of the European influence on the English clubs and so on. And I think clubs now are focusing much more on sports science and sports medicine. That's been a real change in the last 10 years, and I think we were part of that sort of instrumental in changing that back then. So. But it was, it's funny. I mean, even though these players are being paid hundreds of thousands of pounds, I mean, they're exactly the same as players anywhere else. They have the same insecurities, the same issues, the same personal issues, the same, I mean, just because they're getting paid £100,000 a week doesn't mean they don't have the same problems as everyone else. So really, it's pretty much the same.
It's human nature. You don't realize it until you spend every single day like you would have been with them, and you see it. It doesn't matter who you are. Everyone's the same, I reckon.
Exactly. Every team I've ever worked with. I mean, you have all the range of personalities. I mean, yourself from the Aussie cricket team, and there's this massive range of personalities and types of people and so on, and that's what makes it great. It's the challenge, of course, is handling all of those different people, and from a medical point of view, an injury point of view, some of them are need to be nursed along, some of them need to be held back. It's learning how to handle each individual is the big challenge.
So the reason I've got you here, Doc, is something that's obviously I'm a little bit biased on, because it's the way I live my life. It's high fat, low carb way of life. A more stricter of what people probably hear, a lot of ketogenic diets. They hear about ketosis and all this. Well, I'm not saying that I'm in that space. I'm high fat, low carb. I'm drinking a coffee, as you can see right now, with milk in it. So, but it's something that I had, and I was struggling with, particularly my weight. In I think it was 2013 when you were on tour and we were in India. And you just said to me, why don't you try this specific type of diet? And I wasn't playing at the time. Homework gate. Everyone knows what happened that trip. So I had plenty of time on my hands. And I thought, all right, I want to give this thing a fair crack, because I tried just about everything else. Everything else that the nutritionist told me to do, I did. And then I'd do it and would not see any results. You know, in terms of my body composition, I'd be training my backside off and not see anything. And I was like, I just don't get what's going on here. I cannot get. So I remember 2030, I'm like, I'm going to try this. It's something different, something that actually I think I might enjoy doing. And I started doing it. And the results were unbelievable. I mean, for the first time in my life, I could eat as much as I wanted to until I was full, not have to try to starve myself all the time. I could eat foods that I enjoy eating. That, you know, the hardest thing for me was eating cheese and eating olive oil. And I was like, whoa, this is bad. This is full fat stuff. This is bad. I can't, my brain, it would have taken me about a month to get past that. But the results, just in terms of, we're not talking about anything else, because there's plenty of other benefits to it. But right there and then, the results that I had in terms of my body composition and what I've been able to sustain and maintain for a long period of time, and the way that my body's felt and how good I feel during the day now compared to before, was unbelievable. So I want to hear about how you got started on the high fat, low carb diet. I know you've got a book, which I've read, A Fat Lot of Good. A great read for anyone who hasn't read it. High fat, low carb diet get a lot of bad publicity. And I feel like, you know, a lot of people have been taught a certain way during the whole time. So, I mean, the reason you're here is because I want to talk about the high fat, low carb diet. So I'll let you take it away from pretty much how you got started into doing this, and how you know, got a young Australian cricketer to get on it and change his life in a way.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a lovely story. Yeah, my experience was somewhat similar. I mean, I think it was the year before that. It was 2012. I was in Liverpool, and you know, if you'd asked me then, you know, how was I? Was I healthy? You know, how was I feeling? And I'd have said, yeah, you know, I'm good. You know, I'm feeling good, and you know, I'm healthy, and you know, don't take any medications, and I'm fine. The reality is, I probably wasn't quite as healthy as I thought I was. I just turned 60, which was the age my father had developed type 2 diabetes, and I'd seen him live with that for 20 odd years, and saw what it did to his body, and I was pretty determined not to go down that track. So I was, in the back of my mind, I really was conscious of the whole diabetes thing, and so I was 60. I was overweight, probably borderline obese, and like, like many sort of middle-aged men, and I call 60 middle-aged. I used to think it was old, but now I think it's middle-aged. I'd probably put on like half a kilogram a year for 30 years. Every year, just getting a little bit thicker around the belt, and the kids are starting to poke me in the guts and saying, come on, Dad, do something. And I'd just shrug my shoulders, like you. I'd shrug my shoulders and say, well, hang on a minute, I'm on a low-fat diet. I exercise regularly. I'm doing everything I could be doing. And because I'd always been pretty conscious about my diet and things like that, and followed all the guidelines and the low fat stuff and things, and kept getting fatter. And I'd also had a few underlying health issues that I'd sort of ignored. Typical doctor. I'd had a thing called a fatty liver for a few years, which I now understand is like a pre-diabetes thing. I had high triglycerides, had high insulin levels, and so on. So, in retrospect, I was clearly pre-diabetic, and I had no doubt that by now, if I'd continued on the way I was going, I'd have been a fully fledged type 2 diabetic like my father, and with all the sort of complications associated with that. So that's how I was back then. And I have a friend called Tim Noakes, who's a South African scientist, and Tim and I have been friends for a long time. And he's a super smart guy. And he was always someone who challenged, orthodoxies and so on. Anyway, he came out around that time and said, look, I think we've been wrong. I think that we've actually been following this low-fat diet, and we've been focusing on the wrong thing. And it's actually sugars and carbohydrates that are the problems. And he'd turned his own health around. He'd developed diabetes and got overweight and turned his own health around. And I remember hearing this, and I thought, oh, come on, that's ridiculous. Tim's finally lost the plot. He's been right on everything else, but no, he can't be right on this one. But it did prompt me to start reading, and I read a book by a guy called Gary Taubes called Good Calories, Bad Calories, and this book just blew me away. because it not only talked about the pros and cons of why of low fat and low carb, it sort of talked about the politics and the history of how the low carb movement had sort of lost out to the low fat movement back in the sort of 50s and 60s and so on, which for reasons that had nothing to do with science, but everything to do with money and power and the US agriculture system and so on.
Yeah.
And this book just blew me away. And I remember I'd put it down at night and think, no, this couldn't be right. Like, you know, we couldn't have had, the whole of Western society has been on this diet for 40 years.
Yeah.
And here, you know, there's no evidence for it, and it's probably wrong. And I found that really disturbing. I mean, well, anyway, so I read lots of stuff, and the more I read, the more I thought, gee, you know, he's onto something here. And so I thought, well, it's time for a personal experiment, you know. So I thought, okay, well, I'll go onto this low carb, healthy fat diet for 3 months. Give it a go. See what happens. So on day one, I got all my blood tests done and everything like that, and I went on this diet. So I stopped eating sugars, I stopped starches, so I stopped eating potatoes and rice and pasta and bread and all those things, and went back to sort of eating probably the way that my grandparents would have eaten. You know, lots of real food, meat and fish, eggs. You know, we've been told no eggs, because of cholesterol, and full fat cream and dairy and butter instead of margarine, and all the things that. And like yourself, I had real problems, because you had it ingrained in you for all your life that fat was bad. And all of a sudden you're eating all this fat and you think, oh, no, it was really, really quite difficult. But this 3 months was amazing. The first thing that happened was I stopped being hungry. So instead of sort of, having your cereal at 8 o'clock in the morning and then you get to about 10:30 and think, God, it must be lunchtime soon, so you need a muffin, or I'd have my eggs and bacon for breakfast and I wouldn't be hungry all day. So I went from eating 3 meals and 3 snacks a day to probably eating 2 meals a day, and I just have a handful of nuts if I ever got hungry. Then I started to lose weight. So every week I'd get on the scales and I just got, I'd lose a kilogram the first week, and then I think that's just beginner's luck, or a bit of fluid or something, and then it just every week you kept losing weight. And then I started to feel different. I started to feel more energetic, and my exercise got easier, and I could concentrate better. I wasn't getting sleepy during the day. I stopped snoring. I slept better. It was just incredible. So I got to the end of that 3 months, and I'd lost 13 kilograms in 13 weeks, and I just felt fantastic. And I got my bloods done again, and all the issues that I'd had in my blood tests had resolved. I'd had this fatty liver thing for 10 years. And completely got better in 3 months.
That's amazing.
And all my other bloods came back to normal, and it just blew me away. So obviously I've just kept at that diet. I don't even call it a diet actually, because diet to me is sort of a temporary thing. It's just as you said, it's a way of living. That's the way I live, and I really just focus on real food rather than processed food. And just eat pretty simple but really nice, tasty food. So I guess having had that revelation, if you like, and that experience, you sort of got two options really. You can just sort of say, well, okay, that's good for me, and I'll stick with that, and keep my head down and won't upset anyone by telling people. Or I sort of felt I had a moral obligation really to sort of spread the word and tell people about this. And you get a few funny looks from your medical colleagues in particular, but I started talking about it and doing a bit of writing, and then giving lectures, and I just see so many amazing results from people like yourself and others, and the more you sort of saw, the more you wanted to spread the word, and finished up writing a book, and then setting up a charity or campaign called Sugar by Half, and so it's really become my my passion over the last few years, and I'm spending most of my time now working on this campaign, this Sugar by Half campaign. We've got a education program, we've got a corporate program, we're starting up a diabetes program shortly, and it's great. I give a lot of lectures, write a lot of stuff. I get fantastic feedback from people. I get probably an email every day or two from someone, saying they've read my book or heard my lecture, and it's changed their life, and it's very rewarding. But still got a lot of work to do. There's still a lot of people out there, with ill health due to poor diet. And unfortunately, the medical profession, the dietitians don't really get it, and they're still not getting it. And so we've really got to spread the word that sugars and processed foods and vegetable oils are the enemy, not healthy fats.
Well, this has been going on. There was a big shift, wasn't there, after World War II around there, with especially Ansel Keys and his 7-country study, and the food pyramid came out not too long after. I remember food pyramid is the one thing I remember as a kid when I first moved to Australia. As a 4 or 5-year-old, the food pyramid is one thing I remember reading. Of breads, pastas, all this stuff is good, and the fats and the rest are bad. Everyone's afraid of saturated fat. So my question is, I probably have 2 questions on this. The first one is cholesterol bad? And the second one is, you wake up and eat bacon and eggs and all these fatty things during the day. Why is it that you stay fuller for longer? So they're probably my 2 questions out of this.
Okay, all right. Let's answer the second one first. Why do you stay fuller for longer? Because fats and proteins fill you up. Carbohydrates don't. So if you have, let's say you have a potato or a orange juice or something like that, which is basically full of carbohydrates, gets broken down to sugar. It causes then your blood sugars to rise. That releases a hormone called insulin, which then drops your blood sugar. So you have a burst of high blood sugar, you feel good, and then your blood sugar drops, and that's when you get hungry again. So you get this constant cycle of eating, and a couple of hours later being hungry, and you eat again, and so on. So whereas when you eat primarily fats and proteins, your blood sugars stay very stable, stay very level, and you don't have that hunger, and that fills you up. So that's the reason you don't feel hungry, and you go from, some people just do 1 meal a day. I'm a 2 meal a day person, but
so am I.
Others are
Most
one.
days.
So the first part of the question about cholesterol is it's complicated, but to put it simply, we need cholesterol. Cholesterol is really important. It's an important component of our body, particularly our brains. Cholesterol is really an essential building block of our brain tissue and all our nervous system and lots of other things. So we need cholesterol. Obviously, there's concerns about high cholesterol, and those concerns have probably been exaggerated, or have certainly been exaggerated. There are certain types of cholesterol. You hear about good cholesterols and bad cholesterols, and it's very complicated. But certainly, the cholesterol is not as big a problem as people think. And part of the reason that everyone gets obsessed about cholesterol is that because there's a drug for it, and there's a lot of money being made out of that drug, the statins drugs, and for most people they're probably not necessary. And in fact, there's some evidence that having too low a cholesterol can lead to increased mortality rather than too high cholesterol. So I don't worry so much about cholesterol anymore. In fact, I don't worry about cholesterol at all. And I think that metabolically, this low carb, healthy fat diet that we're talking about is there's no doubt now that it is the best for your health, and particularly for those of people like me, middle-aged, a bit overweight, on the way to developing diabetes. I mean, it changes. It's a fantastic way to live, and it's not hard. People say, "Oh, I could never manage without bread," or "I could never," and it really is not hard. And as you and I both found out, and you feel so good on it that you have a day where you eat a crappy day, carb Sunday, as Dave would call it.
You feel like crap.
And you feel like crap, and you're soon reminded, I'm back onto it. So it's a very rewarding thing to do.
I mean, there's been such an exponential growth in obesity, diabetes, heart disease over the last 50, 60 years. And there's no surprise our diets have changed during that time too, to the high carb, low fat sort of diets. And I'm from I'm a science kind of guy. I love physics at school. I did aviation. I'm from that sciencey side. And to me, the correlation is just too deep. I look at it and I'm like, well, what have we changed? What is one thing we changed over before that time? And the one thing we've changed is diet. And I don't get, the government's been involved in this. I sort of have an idea of my view of why this has happened, but I want to hear your view. Why have we been doing this for the last 50, 60 years?
Yeah, well, a lot of it came down to politics and personalities, without going into it in huge detail. But you mentioned a guy called Ansel Keys, and he became a very dominant personality in the nutrition world in the 50s. He did a couple of studies where he purported to show that the higher your fat intake, the more likely you were to have a heart attack. He did as you mentioned, a 6-country and a 7-country study, and he showed a nice correlation between the amount of fat that you had and your chance of having a heart attack. It only turned out some years later that his 6-country study was actually a 22-country study. And when you put the 22 countries in, there was no correlation at all between your fat. He just plucked out 6 countries that happened to give him a nice straight line that showed increased fat and increased mortality. But the reality was there was no relationship at all between fat. But he sold that idea, and he sold the US government on that. And he was a very forceful, dynamic character. And there was actually a nutrition wars in those days. There was a guy in the UK called John Yudkin, who believed that sugar was the problem and wrote about it. And Keyes thought fat was the problem. And Keyes, through, I think, a sense of force of personality and political nous, he won out. And he convinced the US Senate committee that to draw up these guidelines. And it's funny, they set up an expert committee to draw up the guidelines, and that committee came back recommending 2 to 4 serves a day of starches and grains and cereals and so on, and then they sent it off to the US Department of Agriculture, and it came back as 6 to 10 serves. So there was a lot of politics involved. There was a lot of the influence of US agriculture was huge, with all their sort of starchy foods and so on, corn and wheat and so on. And big food and big pharma. So the pharmaceutical companies got onto it because they wanted to treat cholesterol with and they thought that low fat was the way to do that. Then the food industry got onto it, and they wanted to have a whole lot of to sell processed foods that were low fat and high carbohydrates and so on. So which tasted good and sold really well. So we got convinced that we should start the day with cereal. The breakfast that consists of cereal, orange juice, toast, flavored yogurt, and a cup of tea with 2 sugars. And that was that was more than your daily intake should be in one meal. And so there's a lot of very clever marketing and a lot of money made out of this whole thing. But we just got fatter and sicker. Every year since 1980, since these dietary guidelines came in 1980, we've the obesity levels have increased every year, and the diabetes levels have increased every year. Now you'd think, if you're running a business and your bottom line got steadily worse every single year for 40 years, yet at some stage in that 40 years, maybe just once, ask yourself, maybe we're doing something wrong. Maybe we should change something. But no, we've kept the same system going, the same guidelines, the same recommendations for 40 years. We've got fatter and sicker. We've got 70%
too many
of
profits.
Australians.
Too many profits.
70% of Australians overweight. We've got 2 million people with type 2 diabetes in Australia. Probably another 5 million with pre-diabetes. I mean, it's killing us, and we've got to do something about it.
It's the biggest fallacy. I remember I grew up listening to it all the time, that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And I know this is going a little bit off, how we eat, but the fact that we got told my whole life that breakfast was the most important meal of the day, and when I don't train, I rarely ever have breakfast now. And I know it's not the most important meal of the day because I feel great. I mean, I do a little bit of intermittent fasting during the mornings, most days when I don't train, and I feel so much better. And my whole life I was taught that, and I could see that was a marketing gimmick, because that's what Kellogg's and the cereal companies were trying to tell me. It's the most important meal of the day. So eat our cereal. And for me, I think that's the biggest thing, that we've been misled. From government, from all the way to corporations trying to make money, as you know, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. It's a chain reaction in that people eat more, they get addicted to these sugary foods, and they keep eating more, they keep wanting more and more and more, and these guys keep making more and more money. And a lot of studies that, you know, backed this type of diet was actually fueled. I'm sure you could probably talk about this more. From what I know, was fueled by these companies paying for these studies that suited what they sold, suited, you know, their types of products, their low sort of, you know, low fat products, and putting corn syrup and whatnot into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the sugar industry is, you know, put a lot of money into misinformation about the effects of sugar. A lot of research, you know, whenever good research was done that showed that, you know, saturated fat wasn't a problem, they just didn't publish the research, or they hid the research. There were 2 or 3 famous studies that were done in the 70s, the Sydney Diet Heart study and the Minnesota study, that were massive studies, and there's a US women's study done that cost $700 million, you know, and because the results didn't turn out quite the way they wanted, they just fudged the results and buried the data. And it wasn't until 20 or 30 years later that people searched for the data and found out that actually it was completely wrong. And, you know, everything that they'd been sort of pushing was all quite fraudulent in a way. So, you know, the whole basis of this low fat experiment that really Western society has been on for 40 years is based on fraud and it's on falsehoods, and it's incredible. Once you dive into it, I mean, it's just, you can't believe it. I mean, it's quite amazing, and reversing that is really difficult because there are so many people now and businesses and so on that you know, profit by this, and even the medical profession. You know, it's just something that we've been told. You know, I was taught that in medical school, and I've been taught it ever since. And you just assume that it's right. You always assume it's based on good science and reasoning and so on. And in fact, there is no science behind it. So it's pretty scary stuff. But we're very reluctant to change our thinking in medicine. There's a great saying in medicine that 50% of everything you learn in medical school turns out to be wrong. You just have to work out which 50%. And we're not good at working out which 50%, I'm afraid. But we'll slowly get there. But it's a battle, and it's a real battle, and very frustrating at times.
So we hear this a lot about people needing glucose for brains, and being on a low carb sort of diet doesn't give that. You mentioned it earlier. How does that work? Because I feel perfectly fine. I feel like and as I said earlier, there's in everyday food, even if I'm having, you know, a little, you know, coffee with a bit of milk, there's a tiny bit of carbs in there too. There's a little bit of glucose in everything you have. What do you have to say about when people say that? Because that's an argument I get a lot about eating low carb.
Sure. Well, for start, you know, no one's on zero carbs, as you say. I mean, we all have some carbs. You know, I have some carbs, you have some carbs. You know, it's pretty much impossible to be on zero carbs, because the carbs in milk and there's some in green veg and things like that we eat. So, you know, we all have some carbs. The brain needs some glucose, but we can make our own glucose. Through a process called gluconeogenesis, we can break proteins and even fats down into to glucose for the small amount of glucose that is essential. There's very little glucose that's essential for your brain. And that's because the brain can function perfectly well on another form of energy, which is ketones, which is basically fats. And that's hence this term, the ketogenic diet, or the keto diet that you hear about all the time. So ketones can fuel your brain just as effectively as glucose can, and doesn't have a lot of the negative impact of glucose. So yes, your brain does need some glucose. Some of it you'll get even eating a low carb diet. The rest of it you'll make from protein, and your brain is largely fueled by ketones and by fats, and does very well on those.
Yeah, it's a good way to explain it, because I've had a lot of people come up to me and use, that's probably one of them that they use, try to say, oh, and you can't have low carb, you know, it ruins you. So if you go full high fat, low carb, you won't be able to think properly. It'll ruin, even, you can't do a test. You can't do a test if you don't have carbohydrates. Your brain needs them. So what you're trying to say is the brain needs even if it does, it needs a very small amount of glucose to function at maximum.
Yeah. Yeah. And your brain's never going to go short of glucose because you can make as much glucose as you like. So it's not an issue. And in fact, most people who go onto a low carb diet will tell you they think more clearly, they concentrate better, they don't have that brain fog that you often get, and sometimes that's quite dramatic.
Do you think with the whole, you're doing the sugar by half at the moment, you've been a big advocate for high fat, low carb diets. Is the issue still in our schools and in the younger generation being taught? As I told you about, the food pyramid was what I was taught as a kid. And I'm not sure what's exactly going on in public schools at the moment. But if you learn something from a very young age and you've been taught it your whole life, it's very, very hard to get around the whole high fat, low carb way of eating, which was one thing I found growing up a certain way and then trying to flip that on its head. Do we need to, explain to the younger population? Well, firstly, I think more people need to understand what it is, but do we need to explain to the younger population of, hey, there's actually another way of eating and going to schools and giving them the education?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a whole lot of factors in that. I mean, I think as a society, we need to come to the conclusion that sugars and processed foods are not good for you. That's got to be reflected in the dietary guidelines, which are about to be revised. But again, they tend to be very biased by the food industry and by professionals who have links to the food industry who don't want to change. Who feel very threatened by changing their. If you've been telling someone, if you're a dietitian or a doctor, been telling someone to eat low fat for 50 years, and suddenly a bunch of yobbos come along and say, well, you're wrong, then you tend to respond by getting antagonistic and so on. So we have to look at the science. That's the thing. The evidence is there. We just have to open our eyes to it. As far as educating our children go, look, I think we're getting better. I think schools and health programs in schools are realizing that sugar is a major issue. And, schools are banning soft drinks from vending machines and school tuck shops and so on, largely. That's still got a fair way to go. There's a lot more we need to do, things, because there are other sources of sugar. It's not just soft drinks. Even fruit juices, which we've been told for years were healthy, are actually full of sugar. They take all the good stuff out of the fruit and just leave the sugar in the water. Flavored milks and so on are full of sugar. Muesli bars, cereal bars, all these sort of things are full of sugar, and a lot of people don't realise that sauces, sort of barbecue sauce and tomato sauce and all these hidden sources of sugar are out there, and people are going to be made aware of it. And we've got an education program that Sugar by Half are running through Cool Australia that's available to all school teachers and so on, that with lessons on how to count sugars and how to be aware of sugars. But it is a battle because the sugar industry and the soft drink industry and the food industry have massive resources to throw at you. Their marketing is brilliant. Their advertising is brilliant. They target kids obviously with cereals and animals and cartoon characters and all these sort of things. I mean, they know where people are vulnerable, and same with fast food outlets. I mean, the amount of advertising that's done is incredible. So it's very hard. It's not, I don't blame anyone. I don't think you could blame any individual for the way they eat, because we've just got they live in an environment where it's just it's everywhere, and so it takes real sort of courage, I think, to go against the trend and start to eat it sensibly. And for kids, it's hard. There's a lot of sort of pressure on them, and they go to parties, and they other kids are drinking the stuff, and they don't want to be left out and so on. So yeah, I think education is the key to most things, isn't it? And if we start educating kids, and often it's interesting, I give talks at schools and so on, and you get feedback that they take the message through to their back home, and their parents start changing the way they eat. So it's schools are a really important key to all this.
I always tell people when they're talking to me about this like way of life, I want to call it, because that's what I call it. And
Yep.
I say to them, just try it. If you don't believe me, just try it for 3 months. Look, I'm not a medical expert, but you're not going to hurt yourself. If you don't believe me, have a crack, because that's the only way you're going to see whether it works for you individually. And I understand everyone's different. Everyone's different, you know, bodies and way they're going about it. But you don't know unless you try. And that's the hardest thing, I think, finding when I'm talking to people, is to get them to flip the way they think and to actually try to eat the way, you know, the way you're supposed to eat in terms of high fat, low carb. Is there a way to make the transition for people easier? Because it is a big transition, as we've talked. Is there a way to make that easier for them?
Yeah, look, you're absolutely right. It is very challenging. And, you know, you've probably got to find the right time. You know, there's a right time for everyone to do this, I guess. You know, and often if they've had a health scare, or they're, you know, they've had some issue with their weight or something. So I think, you know, there are different ways of doing it. Obviously, some people go cold turkey and, you know, just to change overnight. Some people just gradually eliminate, you know, soft drinks to start with, and then some other things. So it really depends on the individual, whatever's right for you. But I'm like you. I tell people to give it a go for a couple of weeks. You know, you'll notice a change within 2 or 3 weeks. There's no doubt about it. The things you got to be careful of is sometimes you got to you finish up low on salt on this diet, because you know, salt's actually, we're all worried about too much salt, but that's because all the salt's in processed food. So once you stop eating processed food, you actually have to add salt. So that's one of the reasons people can feel a bit crappy on this low carb, high fat diet initially. So just make sure you have lots of salt in the first week or two, but otherwise you'll start feeling better almost straight away, and the weight will start to come off almost straight away. It's, you know, I don't think I've had any overweight male. Females are not quite as consistent, but, you know, 99.9% of males who are overweight will lose weight significantly and regularly once they stop eating carbs. There's no, you know, there's virtually no exception, and the majority of females will do the same. Probably not quite as quickly, but they'll do the same. So, you know, and that's so rewarding. I mean, I'm sure you know, you had the same experience that, you know, you try things for a week, and once you step on those scales, you're motivated to keep going. You say, hey, look at that, you know, and I feel great, and I've lost 1 kilogram. And so, I'll do it for another week. And you get on the scales at the second week and you're still feeling terrific, and you've got all this energy, and you've lost another kilogram, and I'll keep going, you know, and after a while, you know, you're motivated in that way. So it's really just having a crack, I think, is give it a go for 2 or 3 weeks, and then, you know, if it's no good, then fine. But very few people find it no good.
Absolutely. Is there much change in when you do change to high fat diets in terms of the cost? You know, in your opinion, does it cost more?
Well, I think that's a common criticism. You know, people think you're eating fillet steak every night, and so on. But, you know, I wish. But there are a few factors there. For a start, you're eating a lot less. You know, you're only eating twice a day rather than eating, you know, 3 meals a day and 3 snacks a day, and so on. That all adds up a lot to costs. So, you know, you might be actually eating a more expensive dinner, but, you know, you're only eating dinner and not eating lunch and dinner and snacks and things like that. So I think that's a factor there. You can certainly eat, you know, low carb on a budget. There's no doubt about that. You know, you can, if you're smart about the way, you don't have to have, as I said, fillet steaks and so on. You can have cheaper forms of meat or fish. You know, you eat vegetables that are in season, or frozen vegetables. You eat, you know, I always buy my nuts and seeds in bulk. You know, there's lots of ways around. A lot of it revolves around planning and being organised. And, you know, if you're both working, you know, you might do all your cooking on a weekend and so on. One of the things that I've really noticed is, and I'm sure you're the same, was that you cook a lot more. You know, I used to get a lot of takeaway foods, and it was just easy, and, you know, you'd ring up, and but now I really, you know, we cook every night now, and I can't remember the last takeaway food we had, and enjoy cooking a lot more. And it's you know, it's simple and it's easy, and so, you know, but again, you have to be organised for that. You know, you have to do the shopping, and you have to plan the week out and so on, because we're time poor as well as being money poor, and so you need to, you know, be organised to do those sort of things. But if you are organised and you shop cleverly, you can do it on a budget for sure.
Who are the main groups of people, do you think, or do you know, that this way of eating actually helps? Like, who would you be saying
Well,
if you
I think,
hear this?
yeah, I mean, basically anybody who's metabolically unwell. So what we mean by that is that if you've got type 2 diabetes or you've got pre-diabetes, this thing called a metabolic syndrome, or you have high blood pressure or cardiovascular disease or any of those problems, you'll benefit. Obviously, if you're overweight, you'll benefit from it. If you've got an autoimmune disease or fatigue or tiredness and so on, you'll benefit that. I mean, really, I know this sounds crazy, but pretty much everyone will feel better and be healthier on this diet. So there's almost no exceptions, but the people who will benefit most are particularly the people with type 2 diabetes, or people who are heading that way, as I was 8 years ago, when I was pre-diabetic, and I've managed to turn it around, and I'm pretty happy that something might get me, but it won't be diabetes.
Last two questions for you, Doc. This is a bit of tongue-in-cheek one. What are your thoughts on the Gamechangers? I'm sure you would have seen that documentary.
Yeah. Look, I mean, that was a very clever documentary, and it was obviously very biased towards a vegan lifestyle, and very anti meat. And I don't have problems with people who don't eat meat. I mean, that's fine. That's their choice if they're doing it for ethical reasons or so on. I don't think there's good evidence for environmental reasons. I think there are just as many problems with the environment from crops as there is from meat, probably even more. And certainly from a health point of view, you can be healthy as a vegan, but it's much harder, and you need to supplement and so on, because the foods with the best nutrients in them are things like meat and fish and eggs and so on. So it's quite challenging to be healthy as a vegan. But that was a very clever propaganda film. It wasn't very balanced at all. And I've spent the last year, answering people's questions about that. And there are some movies out now that are just as convincing the other way. So you have to be a little bit skeptical. Those people had an agenda. They all benefit financially from a vegan lifestyle. So you've got to be a little bit skeptical about that sort of thing.
Where does an individual actually go to find information on a high fat, low carb diet? Do you have any sources that you would recommend our listeners if someone's interested in going out and learning about it?
Yeah, well, there's this great book, as you mentioned. It's done a lot of good by
it's a very good book.
Crazy Australian. So there are lots of good books out there. I think there are some very good websites out there as well. There's one called Diet Doctor, which is excellent. There's one called, there's an English one called diabetes.co.uk. And there's a very practical one called Ditch the Carbs, particularly with parents of kids and so on, looking for school lunches and things like that, called Ditch the Carbs. We hope to have our own website and app out later in the year, and I'll let you know when that happens. But for the moment, they're the best resources. But there are lots of there's a website called Low Carb Down Under, and they have a lot of good videos. And some really good YouTube videos on all sorts of issues like that. There's a few of mine, a few of Tim Noakes's, there's some of a whole bunch of people. So there's lots of stuff out there if you're looking for information.
Awesome. Thanks for chatting today, Doc. You've been awesome. And as I said earlier, it's something very close to my heart. And the only reason I love talking about it is because I want other people to experience what I've experienced too, from you getting me on high fat, low carb, and how good I feel right now, and the effects I've seen and the amazing stories I've seen that people who have done it. It's been an awesome journey. Hopefully we can keep getting that information out to people and dispelling some of these criticisms. And mate, you've been awesome. So thanks for being on the show.
The pleasure was. It's fantastic. I really enjoyed it, and keep up the good work. And hopefully your new little daughter will benefit from that lifestyle for many years to come as well.
No worries. I'm sure. Thanks a lot, Doc. I appreciate it.
Pleasure.